And as I said, we may finish, maybe finish a little sooner than we usually do with some of the other ones. Um, but anyway, let's see here. Okay. Well, oops, that is not what I wanted. Go back to the beginning. It always does that on me. Okay. So polemics. Well, you may not be familiar with that word. I understand we don't use it a lot in Christian circles. I doubt many of your pastors and your churches have said, "Hey, we're going to do a sermon on polemics today," or on the polemics of Jesus. It's probably not something that you heard much about, but that's okay. I mean, it's understandable. But anyway, so when it comes to polemics, just a quick definition of one kind of definition. So polemics, if you look at a writing or a speech, it could be done in written form. It could just be done talking, a speech. Where a person strongly attacks or defends a particular opinion, person, idea, or set of beliefs, or they might even strongly attack the other person. Yeah, while they're doing this, they may end up kind of like offending the other person. You know what I mean? When they're giving their polemic, that can sometimes happen when you get into polemics. It's a dispute. You're having these disputes. Um, it could be when it comes to like our faith or theology, it can be seen as like the practice of like refuting doctrinal errors or providing corrective beliefs within Christianity, within Christian circles. Um, it could be seen as related to apologetics. I mean, which, apologetics certainly defends our beliefs to the outsider. When you're talking to a Muslim or someone in a cult, like we talked about last week, or someone who is a skeptical person, sometimes you have to end up defending what you believe. You have to articulate it well. You need to be able to defend it to them, not defending in a way you mean to like knock them down, like physically defend them. That's not what I mean. Of course, apologetics is providing a reasoned defense for what you believe. You're able to articulate that, and if they are trying to mischaracterize what you believe, or trying to come against it, or trying to come at you with, a different belief, sometimes you get polemical. Sometimes there's a mix sometimes of polemics and apologetics, but sometimes, a lot of times, polemics is used within within Christianity itself, where sometimes we are, defending our doctrinal beliefs to each other. We think that someone's off track over here, they're off on this doctrine, or not getting it right over here, and we have to get out and kind of refute that in the correct way. But that does happen. So sometimes it happens within Christian circles, like in the insiders. Now, when we talk about Jesus, as we'll talk about, Jesus was mostly doing polemics within the Jewish community. Okay, of course, he's the Jewish Messiah. He is Jewish, and he's dealing with Jews, dealing with the Pharisees, dealing with the Sadducees, dealing with other people, mostly within the Jewish world. So it's kind of like happening on the inside. Once again, he's not so much defending his beliefs to all these different religions around him, or pagans or anything. He's just dealing within his own territory, the Jewish world at that time. And when we, just to kind of say it again, the function of apologetics, of course, is defend one's truth claims. We do it either offensively or defensively. And then we engage in polemics when we're countermanding or challenging the truth claims of others. Now, they may sound very similar there. You're probably saying, whoa, I mean, that just sounds like almost the same thing. And I understand that. But they are related to each other. But we'll look at Jesus a little bit, and we'll see that he got really polemical with the Jewish community. It's like a family dispute in a way, because Jews are seen as a covenantal community. Okay, they don't they are all part of a giant covenantal community under the Abrahamic covenant at that time. I'm talking about Jesus's time, and well, to today to a certain extent. But the point is that he's dealing with people within that covenantal community. They're having disagreements, sharp disagreements. And, D.A. Carson says here about polemical theology, he says, in a world of finite human beings who are absorbed in themselves and characterized by rebellion against God, polemical theology is an unavoidable component of any serious theological stance, as the Bible itself makes clear. D.A. Carson is a well-known New Testament scholar. He's been around a long time, written a ton of books. Now, when you think of the word like insult, if you look at it as a noun and a verb, we say, an insult is an offensive remark or action, of course, right? And then as a verb, it's when we generally say or do something that's rude or offensive, right? When we say someone insulted me, they offended me, they made an offensive remark or action to me, I found that to be an insult, right? So if you go by that definition, then Jesus probably insulted a lot of people, okay? Meaning that he made offensive remarks to those around him, to the people that he was dealing with, okay? At least what they perceive to be an offense, right? And I'm sure he's well aware of that. But the point is that it would be considered offensive, okay? And I think that sometimes with Jesus, honestly, I think in today's world, I think most Christians kind of view Jesus as this guy. I think that most Christians, or not all Christians, but some Christians just view Jesus as kind of like Mr. Rogers. I grew up watching Mr. Rogers. Many of us maybe did. Maybe you saw the Tom Hanks movie, whatever. But the point is that when I thought of my mom put on Mr. Rogers on TV, and I was a little boy watching it, just sitting there on the floor watching. I mean, he brought this very, very calm approach, loving, calm, never stressed out, never impatient, never anxious, just kind of like this soothing voice, right? When you hear Mr. Rogers talk. And that's what he meant to do, of course. Now, I don't need to go into the history of Mr. Rogers and talk about whatever people think about him. I'm just trying to say that, many Christians, I think, sometimes view Jesus as kind of like, a guy that talked like Mr. Rogers. He loved children, which he did, but maybe just his tone and the way he can. Well, we don't have a video of Jesus's tone. We don't know the exact tone of his voice, but the point is that the way Jesus comes across is kind of like very much like Mr. Rogers. Very calm, peaceful, never getting upset, just really, really calm. So I don't think that's the case always with Jesus. I don't think that's the case a lot of times. Because when it comes to Jesus, if you go back here, did Jesus insult people? If you go by insult defining as an offensive remark or action, or to say something that's rude or offensive, if you go just start reading the New Testament, as you guys probably know, there seems like Jesus is saying a lot of very offensive things to his audience. I mean, when you're disputing in John 8, going back and forth, as he's going back and forth with the Jewish leadership, I mean, how would you like it if this Jewish guy that has no official rabbinic ordination, I mean, he's not he was, as far as we know, he wasn't some high teacher from any of the Jewish educational schools at that time, born in a poor family, Joseph, the carpenter's son, all this stuff. And he comes along and says to you, the leadership, he says, you are the father of the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, does not stand the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character. He's a liar and the father of lies. Now, what if I, on a college campus today, where we do our ministry, if I had our question of the day, what if I had a question that said, are you of the father, the devil? Are you of your father, the devil? Yes, no, or I don't know. Or if I've had a quote that said, you all are the father of your devil. all you people are wrapped up in all your transgenderism or whatever sin it is, because everybody's got sin. But if I put that on a whiteboard and showed up on a college campus, I probably, that would be considered offensive, right? Just obviously, they think that guy's offensive, and he's with that Christian group, and they're offending people. Look, if they're saying everyone here is of the father, the devil, they're accusing people of having the devil as a father. I mean, they probably would be so mad, and they probably come up and say, I don't think that's really what Jesus would do. They'd say Jesus was nice. He wouldn't do that. Now, this verse, of course, has entire context to it in John 8. And we know that um, the religious leaders brought up this issue of the parents, right? The parental issues in John 8:41, saying, talked about Abraham as our father, we're from seed of Abraham, and et cetera, et cetera. And then Jesus comes along and counters that and says, well, really, your spiritual heritage comes from the devil. And you match, because what you're doing is the same thing the devil will do. He's a father of lies, and you're the same thing. So that would be very offensive, okay? And Jesus is doing, some polemical back and forth and some polemics there, okay? So just off the bat, when I look at this guy back here, I don't think he would say something like that, right? So Jesus is a little different from Mr. Rogers. I hope we all know that. You're like, of course I know that, Eric, being silly. Now, we're going to spend a little time in Matthew 23. Now, I don't know if you maybe want to have your Matthew 23 chapter in front of you, whatever you want to do, because this is one chapter where Jesus really says some incredibly offensive things, very offensive things. What you would, if you're listening, it would consider, that audience would think that's rude, that's offensive, and Jesus doesn't seem he's very nice. But the background of Matthew 23 is you got to remember that when Jesus is speaking here in Matthew 23 about these woes he's going to say to the Jewish leadership, I hope you're familiar with this chapter. If you're not, you need to have it in front of you. But this is really, Jesus is the culmination of a history of Israel's relationship with the prophets. Okay? And if you read the Old Testament prophets, there's some very harsh language. I could just put up quotes here from the prophets, things that would be almost identical to what Jesus is saying, very similar things. And so Jesus is really speaking here. He's like the culmination of all the prophets. And what he's saying here, is in the same theme of what the prophets have been saying through the Old Testament. Now, there's a good book called Israel's Last Prophet by David Turner, and a lot of it, there's a big section on Matthew 23, because Jesus is Israel's last prophet. And just as the Jewish prophets were rejected in the Old Testament, Jesus is rejected too, right? And so like I said, there's a this is an ongoing theme in Israel's history, okay? So what Jesus is saying here is not totally radically new, but really, let me skip ahead here for a second. I want to mention before that if you read Jeremiah, Jeremiah had a great deal to say about the rejection and the persecution of the prophets, right? He talked about how God had been sending prophets to Israel since the Exodus. Remember, Moses was a prophet. He got rejected at times, right? But Israel had not listened to them, right? And Jeremiah, of course, is subjected to rejection, beatings, stocks, trials, death threats, everything. So he's persecuted. But Jeremiah, if you read Jeremiah, of course, there's always this theme. He's telling the Jewish people, telling Israel, you have rejected the prophets. You constantly rejecting the prophets. You're not listening to them, okay? And that's an ongoing problem. We have the same thing when you read Ezekiel. The beginning of Ezekiel, if you guys read it, you probably know that God tells Ezekiel to go to speak to Israel, or go speak to, the Israelites or the Jewish people. And he tells them ahead of time, they're not going to listen to you. They're rebellious. I'm going to make their heads I'm going to make their heads like flint. He talks about how he's going to harden them. So Israel won't even listen to Ezekiel, but he said that's an ongoing problem. They haven't been listening. They're not going to listen to you, and you're going to be rejected by them, right? So Ezekiel, of course, is rejected, but God wants them to fulfill the task. I don't know about you, but if God told one of you ahead of time that he wants you to go to a specific people group and evangelize them, but he told you ahead of time, they aren't going to listen to anything you're going to say, I'm going to harden their hearts. What would you say? I'm out of here. I'm not doing that job. Find someone else, God. I don't have the time. This is silly, and I don't want to get rejected. But Ezekiel's ministry was probably more about faithfulness. God still wanted him to be faithful despite how crazy it was, he told him he's going to be rejected ahead of time. So the point is, Jeremiah talks about the prophets not listening, or the people aren't listening to the prophets. Ezekiel is rejected as well as a prophet. So, if you look at the prophets of the Old Testament, Jesus's teachings, it's the same themes. He promises blessings for obedience, warnings for disobedience, and then, of course, holds out the hope of restoration, turning to repentance, restoration and repentance, right? So when you go back to Matthew 23, Jesus's charge here, especially when he says in verse 20, I'll go over the other woes here, but the point is that at one point he says that Israel has rejected its own prophets, right? And that's the root cause of every other problem, okay? Because they keep rejecting what God's saying through the prophets, okay? And of course, we know that they rejected John the Baptist. He's a prophet, right? So that's even happening before Jesus gets to Matthew 23, right? They reject him, his message. They reject John the Baptist. In the beginning of Matthew, it talks about the genealogy of Jesus, which stresses the exile to Babylon, which is due to the rejection of the prophets. Okay, so when it comes to Matthew 23, Jesus pronounces these woes, and I would say they would be perceived as quite offensive. Okay, a woe is what we might call a exclamation of grief. It's Jesus is, he's upset, he's sad. It's a grief. He's grieving. When he's giving these woes. Okay, he's prophesying judgment and talking about all the other problems they're having, but he's doing it with a heart of grief. Okay, these woes, and there's like 7 of them, right, in Matthew 23. So they're addressed to the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, and I'm going to talk about the Pharisees a little more when we're done with these woes. But he calls them blind guides, right? And we know that at the end of Matthew 20, he calls them snakes and brood of vipers. I mean, that's pretty polemical. The first of the 7 woes condemn the scribes and the Pharisees for keeping people out of the kingdom of heaven. Like, what's he say here? Woe to you, teachers of the law and the Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. Yourselves do not enter, nor you let those who are trying to enter. So that's a pretty serious issue, right? The Pharisees are doing something. They're keeping people out of the kingdom. Okay. And then Jesus condemns them for the same hypocrisy that they practice, right? There's always this theme of hypocrisy, as we probably know. Hypocrites, hypocrites, hypocrites. We'll talk more about that. And Jesus calls them, and the third will, blind guides and blind fools. Now, that's not very much like Mr. Rogers. I don't think Mr. Rogers would call someone a blind guide and a blind fool. So Jesus is he's definitely offending them, and he's being offensive, by calling them blind guides and blind fools. And then he also calls them out on the 4th of the 7 woes for their hypocrisy in the practice of tithing, right? They make the big deal out of the small things like tithing spices while they ignore the more crucial matters, right? Right? They diligently count their mint leaves to give every 10th of one to the temple, but they neglect the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness, right? And then Jesus uses hyperbole He says, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. In other words, they're careful to avoid offense in minor things of little importance while tolerating greater sins, of course. And then he spends time in the fifth woe. He likens them to dishes that were cleaned on the outside but left dirty inside, right? They have all these religious observances. They look like they're clean and virtuous, but inwardly their hearts are full of greed and self-indulgence. And of course, we know that that can happen to us as well. We may, on the outside, look really good, we may look really religious, we may look like we're doing the right thing, checking the boxes, but on the inside, we're just dirty, right? And then in the sixth woe, Jesus compares them to whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, and the inside, they're full of bones of the dead and everything unclean. Boy, that is not very kind of Jesus. That sounds very, very judgmental and very, very offensive, right? So Jesus definitely, this would be considered an insult. He's insulting them. He's saying things that are offensive to them, I'm sure, right? And so, and then in the seventh woe, Jesus directs it to those who erect monuments and decorate the tombs of the prophets of old. And then he blames the Pharisees for this, kind of this, what happened to the prophets and their ancestors. He says, you're really not doing anything differently, right? And he says, if we lived in the days of our ancestors, we had not taken part with them shedding the blood of the prophets. He's basically saying, listen, you've inherited the wickedness of your ancestors, even though there were no Pharisees really in the Old Testament, technically. But the point is that they're doing the same thing that they did to the prophets. Okay, the rejection, what they did to the prophets. Okay, and Jesus knows he's going to be killed. He knows he's the final prophet. He knows that they're rejecting him, and their attitude towards him is the same as the people had towards the prophets in the Old Testament. Same thing, same ongoing problem. Okay. Now, when you think about hypocrisy, if you kind of like sum up what Jesus is doing, it's really like, of course, it's an inconsistency between what one teaches and what one does. Obviously, that's going on there. There's also a desire for prestige, being seen, power, congratulation. There's an abuse of teaching authority. There's an over concern with really, really minor details and not focusing on the major issues. There's inconsistency between appearance and practice. So Jesus, he's accusing the Pharisees for hypocrisy, right? Because they abused their teaching authority, they didn't live according to what they taught, and they desired power, they desired to be seen, and they neglected the more important matters for little minor things, okay? So, that is something that, Christians get accused of a lot of hypocrisy sometimes. I know that Christians, people say, oh, I don't go to the church anymore because there's a bunch of hypocrites there. I always tell them, well, come on down. We're all hypocrites. Price is right. Come on down. Join us. Everybody's a hypocrite. But the point is that, Jesus is definitely not happy with this. So he's calling them hypocrites continuously. Okay, using the word hypocrites a lot. Okay. Now, in Michael Wilkins' book, he has a book called, he has a commentary on Matthew. It's part of the NIV application commentary. It's like a set of commentaries. He takes Jesus's 7 woes against the scribes and the Pharisees, and he turns them around to offer some positive lessons for us. Okay, so what he wants us to do is learn, okay, from their mistakes, right, and do the opposite, which is, first of all, live by example, God's message of grace. We earn respect and honor. We don't demand them, right? We wear titles lightly. We don't get into this title thing. Sometimes in churches are really into titles. Whatever they are, they're supposed to point to Jesus, okay? Not point to yourself and how great you are. We serve God's people to empower them to advance the kingdom of God. We, of course, are a signpost of the doorway to the kingdom. And of course, whenever we're sharing Jesus, we always want to make converts, people we want to make disciples. We want to point people to Jesus, not to ourselves, not to ourselves, right? We don't strive to get the adulation. Um, we should be majoring on the majors of the kingdom, not the minors. Um, we should be promoting the right motives for ministry, not doing it for your own self-glorification. We develop leadership and who we are through starting on the inside, on the heart, right? We choose carefully traditions we might hold to. We also listen to other people because leadership has stricter condemnation, right? Whenever a leader, we have to have some accountability. People around us, of course, that goes without saying. So we can learn from their mistakes. Okay. Now, a little bit more about the Pharisees. I just want to mention some things. So, as I mentioned before, I think you may remember that Jesus's relationship with the Pharisees and their polemical dispute. That's what's going on. They're having these polemical disputes. They're disagreeing. They're having harsh words are being said. Um, in some ways, it looks like insults, but like I said, it's the inside Jewish community. These are insider issues they're dealing with. Okay, and is because of Jesus's discussions with the Pharisees that Christians have read those texts for 2,000 years and have basically misunderstood those texts. And in many cases, it's led to a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism. Okay. Because sadly, most Christians, when they've read the word Pharisee, they think, oh, that's all the Jews. The Jews are like the Pharisees. They're the hypocrites. They're the hard-headed, people that rejected Jesus. They're the ones that killed Jesus. And so many people throughout the centuries have just put all the Jews into one big box. And, the Pharisees are the most evil, demonic people on the face of the earth. Not accusing anyone here of saying that, but the point is that is the way it's been sadly or kind of perceived within the Christian world for so many years and so many centuries. And it's led to a lot of anti-Semitism and a lot of mistreatment of Jews. Okay. Now, the Pharisees were uh, certainly one of the most influential religious sects within Judaism at that time, and they were known for putting their emphasis on piety. And the word for Pharisee comes from a Hebrew word meaning separated. They believed in a oral tradition. That means that they believe on top of the written Torah that Moses received, he also received the oral Torah, more revelation outside of the written Torah. And that oral tradition eventually became the rabbinical literature. Um, but the Pharisees were definitely trying to protect the Jewish community at the time of Jesus. They'd had a lot of problems with idolatry. They're under Roman rule. They can still use their temple. They can live a Jewish life. It's not perfect, but they still have access to their temple. They can live a religious, they have religious and sociological things they can do. I mean, as a Jewish community, Pharisees definitely don't want to sabotage that. They don't want a bunch of problems. They want to protect the Jewish community. They obviously went about it the wrong way in some ways, but from all the history of Israel, they were trying to, implement. They were trying to keep Israel pure, away from the impact of probably Roman polytheism, and paganism, and all these other false religious practices, Hellenism, all those things were going on. So anyway, and they also, what we need to remember is that they mostly consisted of middle class businessmen and leaders of the synagogues. They were a minority in the Sanhedrin, and they held a minority position as priests, some of them, right? But they also seemed to have an impact on decision making of the Sanhedrin because they had support among the people. Remember, some of the Pharisees' doctrines put them at odds with the Sadducees. They didn't agree. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. The Pharisees did. Um, Sadducees didn't believe in miracles. The Pharisees did. They had some disagreements over the Torah. You could say the Sadducees, but they both were involved in the putting Jesus through the crucifixion, like they were both involved in the leadership with that, with the Sanhedrin and everything. Just remember, though, um, sometimes Christians like to call each other Pharisees. You do something hypocritical, you Pharisee. I had a guy years ago. I was a brand new Christian, didn't know anything, and he did some job for me. I had my own company at the time. He didn't do it right, and I told him he needed to fix it. And I wouldn't pay him. He said, "You're being like a Pharisee. You're a hypocrite. You come out here and you act like you're all Christian. You won't pay me." I was like, "No, I'm not being hypocritical. You need to do the job right." But anyway, he just loved to call me a Pharisee. So, because he thought I was a hypocrite. So we tend to throw that word around a lot, but never, you don't want to use it as synonym for Jews or Judaism. Okay, you don't want to do that. You don't want to put all the Jews in the category of the Pharisees. Okay, it only refers to a small group of Jews at that time, which eventually morphed into rabbinic Judaism. But just remember, the Pharisees were one of many Judaisms. Okay, there were the Essenes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots. The Essenes were a part of the Qumran community. That's where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls from. They're the ones that broke away from the religious establishment, right? And they went out in the desert and started their purity community. I walked right through that community the remains of that when I was in Israel. Um, and Jesus, of course, in his community are called the Nazarenes. Paul's the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, Acts 24:5. But all these different sects of Judaism at the time all believed in one God. They believed Israel was God's elect nation. They were committed to Torah, and they saw the temple as central to the Jewish faith. They all had that in common. Okay. Now, Jesus and the Pharisees got into it at a deep level because both were certainly committed to the revelation of God through the Torah. Remember, Jesus quoted the Torah a lot in his ministry. He quoted Deuteronomy a lot, quoted other passages from the Torah, but they just disagreed sometimes on the interpretation. Okay, and a large part of Jesus's critique was that the Pharisees should have been seen loving God and people as the highest priorities of Torah, right? Love God, love people, right? Two greatest commandments. And at one point, Jesus expected his disciples to outdo the Pharisees, literally in loving God and people. Okay, remember that one passage says, "Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees." That's interesting. He actually said the Pharisees were righteous, and it's interesting, despite all the hypocrisy, right? Now, this quote's kind of interesting in James Charles's book, The Historical Jesus. He says, "Was Jesus an Essene, a Pharisee, a Zealot, or a Sadducee? The question also is now exposed as uninformed. Jesus was certainly no Zealot or Sadducee. He was close in many ways to the Essenes and especially some Pharisees, but he was neither an Essene nor a Pharisee. Jesus was influenced by some Essene ideas and many Pharisaic thoughts, but he was not an Essene nor Pharisee, let alone a Zealot or Sadducee. He was unique and gave rise to a new Jewish sect, this new Jewish sect, okay? And so that's kind of an interesting quote. So Jesus had commonality with some of these different sects, but more, he definitely had some things in common with the Pharisees. We don't make it out to be like, I can't even tell you this, that I've studied anti-Semitism, how much how much anti-Semitism has resulted by Christians reading the passages between Jesus and the Pharisees and not understanding first century polemics, what was really going on there, Jewish polemics. Okay, you could put a room of rabbis together in a giant room, and they could get really harsh with each other and debate. They still do that to this day sometimes. So I could see the scene, Jesus just and them going at it verbally, but obviously we don't have a tape recording of it, but I could kind of picture it. Now, as I said before, an insult, as a noun, is an offensive remark or action. An insult as a verb is to say or do something to someone that is rude or offensive. And, if you look at that as a definition, yeah, it seems like there's insults by Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. You know, Jesus, Mark 3:31-34, Jesus rejects his family by implying his mother and brothers are not really his mothers and brothers. Of course, he calls people hypocrites many times. He calls, uses that reference to dogs, which is referred to Gentiles, or they're unclean. If you read Mark 7:27, he says to what about saying to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan"? How'd you like to be your disciple of Jesus? And he says to you, "Get behind me, Satan." You'd be like, "Ugh, that is that is really harsh, right?" He calls them an adulterous and sinful generation, a faithless generation. He calls the money changers robbers, right? We know about the temple the temple scene when he goes in the temple and cleans the temple. Says to the Sadducees, they don't know the scriptures or the power of God. That could be perceived as an offensive remark or an insult, right? And then, of course, we know in Matthew that, once again, he uses the word hypocrites a lot: dogs, pigs, ravenous wolves, workers of lawlessness. Of course, these all have context. I know that. You'd have to read the context. He equates the whole town of the Jewish towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, Matthew 10. In the book of, and then he also, he talks about in Matthew 11 about those cities that are worse than the cities condemned by the Old Testament prophets. It says Capernaum is worse than Sodom. He calls them a brood of vipers in Matthew 12, as I talked about, calls them evil and adulterous generation. He said this generation is worse than Nineveh in Matthew 12. Matthew 12, he says the evil generation is akin to being demon possessed. Same things, but Jesus could be seen as saying offensive things, no doubt about it. Things that could be perceived as insults, right? What we call an insult today. And then the book of Revelation, Jesus calls a group of unbelieving Jews the synagogue of Satan. Not all Jews. Okay, just that's another verse has been used for anti-Semitism. He refers to a town because of its false religion as Satan's throne in Revelation 2:13. He calls Revelation 2:20-22, calls a woman Jezebel and promises to punish her and her followers. Same thing, Revelation 3:9 calls a group of unbelieving Jews the synagogue of Satan. And then he gets to the churches in Revelation 3:17. He calls one church wretched, another pitiable, another poor, blind, rebuking those churches, of course. So, Jesus certainly was not Mr. Rogers, as I've been saying here, right? Now, what does this mean? Does this mean like, am I saying because Jesus was perceived as insulting people, right? He's making offensive remarks, right? I went over some of them, especially Matthew 23. So we talked about, but does that mean that we deliberately go out and try to insult somebody? And once again, go back to the definition of insult. As a noun, it's an offensive remark or action. As a verb, to say something or someone is rude or offensive. Okay. You're going to speak, if you're going to say something, you're going to speak out Christian principles in the culture around us. It's going to be seen as offensive. I think we all know that, right? Christians are seen as offensive. The gospel is offensive in itself. The message is offensive in itself, right? So it could be seen as an insult, but if you don't affirm someone's transgenderism, you don't affirm their homosexuality, you don't affirm, their fornication, you don't affirm them in some other thing, you could be seen as offensive to them, right? You're being insulting. If someone invites you to participate in a certain sin and you say, I'm not going to do that because I can't agree with that. And they say, oh, you're insulting me. That's an insult, because they have their identity wrapped up in that thing. But, so sometimes we'll be seen as just offensive, right? We're offensive in what we say and sometimes just who we are, right? It's not that we always deliberately set out to do it. It's just that sometimes our positions on things, will have that impact. It doesn't mean, of course, we're like I said, it's not because Jesus was perceived as insulting people or offending them. It doesn't mean that we go out of our way, like I said, to always insult somebody or use it as a primary form of engagement. But if if someone walks up to you and says, "Do you think homosexuality is a sin, or do you think transgenderism is a sin?" You say, "Yes." That actually happened today to me. Someone asked me if I thought homosexuality is a sin. I said, "Yes." I didn't even. Well, I'm sorry. I don't want to say it. Well, I don't want to offend you. Well, I'm not sure. I just want you to think. I'm trying to be really nice. No, I just said yes. I said yes, and I understand that can be seen as offensive, right? So whatever. That's just the way it is. Okay. Now, remember, saying sometimes harsh things to people is not always automatically wrong, right? Sometimes you do have to get polemical sometimes. And I can tell you that, it comes to polemics, at the beginning, talking about these religious disputes. I've had major polemical conversations with people from other religions, that's for sure. I mean, it can get heated at times, okay? But we certainly need to be, our speech needs to be tempered with wisdom, but sometimes it might get seen perceived as harsh. But I think Christians are awfully afraid of how they talk today and are very, very, very timid and very cowardly at times. Um, and I think that we're deathly afraid of what people think of us more than what God thinks. But we have to understand that it's not always wrong to speak the truth when dealing with people's rebellion against God. I told you the story, I think a couple months ago. I said I had a Muslim came up to me and started arguing with me right off the bat, just came right at me. And, I tried to reason with him a little bit. I saw it wasn't going anywhere. And he finally said to me, "You're out here preaching a false religion, and, you guys are a bunch of idolaters." And I said, "We think the same things about you." That's what I said. I said, "Actually, we view you as idolaters, and we view you as preaching false religion." Some of my, well, that's offensive. Eric, you need to be kind to him. No, at that point, I'm just going to speak the truth. You know what I mean? And whatever, because that's the truth. So had to get harsh. So sometimes, you think about it, like we always press in and say, how can we be like Jesus to other people? Jesus embodies truth and love. He's not like Mr. Rogers, but he certainly was loving, but he spoke the truth. Sometimes you forget the truth part, or sometimes we only emphasize truth and forget the love part, or sometimes you only emphasize the love part and forget the truth part, right? But like I said, sometimes we don't speak the truth in love is because of fear of man. Of course, we're afraid of strained relationships or friendships. I have this ongoing debate with a friend of mine who's a believer over going to gay weddings. And I told him I can't do it. I said, I'm not going to go participate in a celebration of something that God doesn't consider a marriage. I said, I'm not going to. Well, you said, well, don't you want to support them? No, I'm not supporting them in it. I'm not. I mean, I love them, but I'm not going to support them. And me showing up there is like, you're not. What are you going to do? Like, oh, I'm here. I'm at the wedding. I don't support the wedding. I don't support them getting married because it's not a marriage in God's eyes. It's a sin. But I'm still here to support them. That makes no sense. You're a wedding is a public celebration of something God has done between two people, okay? At least biblically defined. A marriage is what God has ordained in his definition, right? So you're there celebrating something that isn't a marriage and isn't a wedding. It really isn't a marriage in God's eyes. You're trying to act like you're being loving. Oh, I just want to be there to support them. Whatever you want to do, your presence there is a public declaration of a celebration. A wedding is a celebration of two people coming together, right, and forming a union. Okay, you do what you want, but I take a firm stance on that. So my other Christian friends struggling with it. I don't know why, but anyway, sometimes we don't speak to others when is needed because of fear of rejection. As I said, we may come across as we're afraid we might come across as self-righteous. I mean, sometimes that can happen. And then sometimes we don't speak the truth in love because we just don't know what to say. Of course, we can get prepared, right? We can train up and work hard on how to speak the truth in love, right? So that can be overcome. And, you've got to speak the truth to yourself. I mean, before you speak it to somebody else, you've got to believe it, right? You've got to speak it into your own heart and be like, yeah, this is this is my conviction in this area. This is what I believe. I've looked into it. I prepared. I know the truth, and I'm ready to speak this, into whatever the situation. Of course, we have to speak the truth in our own homes, speak the truth and love in our own homes. We have to speak the truth and love in our churches. Um, we have to speak the truth and love to a hostile world. And I've said it before that most people that are caught up in certain bondage, you take someone in transgenderism or whatever it is, you run into your addiction or, so many things, you loving them is good, but you loving them is not going to set them free. Okay. It's truth that sets them free, right? They need to hear the truth. They need to consider the truth. Hopefully they will obey the truth. They'll make an adjustment in their thinking, like, oh, that's true. I'm believing something that's false. I need to now believe the truth and act on the truth. So and so presented me with the truth. Now I know what I need to do. I didn't know what the truth was till you presented it to me, because you had the courage to speak the truth in love, right? Now you can't make them act. You can't make them act on truth, but you're called to speak the truth in love and let the chips fall where they may, right? But truth is what sets them free. Okay. We just have this thing in Christianity. I just need to love them. Just love on them. Just love them. By all means, love them, but you can love someone into destruction. Okay. If you keep going that route, you can just keep loving them and let them destroy themselves. As I said, you can't make them act on the truth, but you're supposed to speak the truth in love, right? And then, obviously, before we speak the truth in love, we have to pray for wisdom, pray that we're prepared, pray their hearts are prepared. And obviously, it takes a lot of wisdom and discernment. And I'm not saying that, we need to go out and be like, hey, I need to just constantly everywhere I go, I've got to find every situation to speak into, and this person needs to hear from me, and I need to speak to them, and I'm gifted, and I can tell them this. I don't think that's the route you want to take. I just think that as you go along in your Christian life, there will be opportunities to speak the truth in love. And I think we need to just do it and let the chips fall where they may, right? So there's probably opportunities we've had to speak the truth in love. We haven't done it. We've been afraid, right? But you know what I found out more and more is that people just don't know. They simply don't have the information. They don't know what we believe a lot of times. They don't know what a biblical stance is on this. They don't know why a biblical stance is better than what they're doing. They just need someone to walk them through and explain it to them. They just don't know. So look at yourself as that you're a blessing. I mean, God's using you to help this person, right? This person needs help. They're like, they're struggling, right? And God can use you in their life, right? But if you just got to speak up to them, speak the truth in love. So, as I said at the beginning, I think that Jesus, doing polemics, certainly in the context of the Jewish community he was in, it was an in-house debate, a lot of things he's having. I guess we could apply that in some ways in a Christian context. We have these in-house debates sometimes, things we don't agree on. Hopefully we're not agreeing on we're not breaking fellowship over the minors. The majors are the issues, right? But we certainly we've had our disputes over the centuries and not agreed on certain things. And as I said, I don't think Jesus is Mr. Rogers. Okay. I know that you may find that to be silly, but I think a lot of Christians view him as like Mr. Rogers or Barney the dinosaur. And Jesus was not like that. Okay. So, like I said, we don't have a videotape of the way he spoke, his tone, but if we defined an insult as an offensive remark or action, or to say something is rude or offensive, Jesus could certainly, in many cases, be perceived by others, the people he was speaking to. So, anyways, So that's about all I have. I told you it's gonna be a little shorter tonight, but we're gonna wrap it up. It's 8:25. Some of you came in late. I apologize, but you'll have to get the clip. Um, so almost an hour, a little less than usual, but better than nothing.